Kate, hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm well, thank you.
I've just realised I've got, I had us on a particular kind of view where we could only see one of us at a time, but I've got us both up there now.
Okay,
You didn't need to know that, sorry, but just for our audience,
that's all
we'll change the view just as we're starting.
right.
Hello, this is a very unprofessional start. Sorry. So Kate, we're asking people to introduce themselves and then give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Yep. So I'm Kate Morrison, and I wrote a book which was published last year by Jacaranda Books. It's called A Book of Secrets. There it is.
Hey.
There she goes. And it's about a girl from Ghana who is brought over to England as a baby in the sort of late 16th century and grows up in a great household, secretly Catholic household, and then she goes on to marry a printer and gets embroiled in sort of secret printing presses, Catholic intrigue and plots while trying to find her lost brother. So it's late 16th century London, and there's a lot of espionage and secrets, as the title suggests.
Yeah, great, thank you. Do you mind telling us something about the work that goes into writing a book like that? The relationship between any sort of research you're doing plus the creativity you're bringing to that research. Could you tell us a bit about that process?
Yeah, well, I think probably for me at the beginning, the research took over because it was so interesting. And I think that's probably true of most historical fiction. Like if you're writing historical fiction, you're interested in history and you can go off on so many tangents. There's always something new to discover, and it's quite hard to know when to stop and kind of let the creativity take over, especially because you're worried about getting things wrong, and you have to ask yourself at various points, how strictly am I going to stick to, the historical record, and where can I let my imagination go a bit, even with things like, in this case, Susan's married to a printer, and when he dies, I have her kind of taking over the print business, which did happen. There are a lot of printing widows, and a lot of them did have technical ability, but there's no formal record of how women would have picked those skills up or what interactions they would have had in the household with the workspace. But again, you have to think, with Elizabethan homes, everything happens so close together that inevitably you would have had a crossover between the sort of the domestic and the workspace. And if you were a woman who was interested and wanted to pick it up, and you had a husband who was willing, then it seemed to me that likely you would have had the opportunity to get involved more than we can see from the record.
So that space where domestic life and work life meet each other sounds like it was very important. We recorded a video a few weeks ago with Catherine Richardson about domestic life in early modern England, and she was making the point that we're all now living in a very early modern world where suddenly we're trying very hard to learn how to work from home, but actually that's very much how work functions in early modern England. And as you're saying, that means that women who might otherwise be expected to be living a domestic life rather than a work life, that binary doesn't exist because the two are happening within the same space.
Exactly.
So that site became very important to you, and in terms of that meeting place between research and then where you take off from that research imaginatively.
Yeah, I think that was a particular point where I had to decide how bold I was going to be with it. Also in how far women might have got involved with especially with the secret Catholic printing presses, how far women would have got involved with not necessarily espionage, but obviously illicit activities. And I think reading Nadine Ackerman's book, Invisible Agents, which is slightly later, the 17th century, but talking about women spies. And I think women, often motivated very much by faith, I think were very much involved in, secret activities, again, even if it's not necessarily on record. So I found it very interesting because partly because of the perception that we have from a modern perspective, which unfortunately I think for most people still is women looked after children and brought them up, and that was what they did, and men worked and that was what they did, and they were very separate. And actually, because you've got this space, the home, where work takes place, where again any illicit activities you're involved in take place, you know, how it's just unrealistic to think that it would have been completely separate, and that all you've got is women kind of somehow cooking and looking after kids and not having any involvement in this at all. But yeah, it's difficult because there comes a point where you've talked to as many academics as you can about what we actually know and read the texts and kind of gone, okay, so now I'm just gonna have to make it up and decide to be okay with that, because there's always a fear that someone is going to write to you and go, well, hang on a minute, that's definitely not true and you've just made that up. And you're like, well, actually it is a work of fiction, and so I've used my imagination at this point, and but hopefully based on enough factual evidence that it's not going to be completely unrealistic.
Yeah, thank you. What, this is maybe a more general question, probably a really naive question, so I'm sorry, but what is it about historical fiction which prompts that very strange response? Because you would never say that about an imaginative world set in the contemporary period, that hasn't happened. It's a very, very curious reaction, isn't it?
It is a very curious reaction. I don't know if there's some bleed that people see between kind of historical non-fiction and fiction, where again, and even, you know, with history, I suppose there's this sense that if you're writing a history book, that's facts, and what you've got dates, you've got names, you've got evidence that you can find. But I know every historian would say that as soon as you get to sort of going beyond that, there's got to be an element of subjectivity in how you interpret the evidence. But yeah, I think with historical fiction, there's people want it to be right, and maybe it's because they want to believe that you're really capturing the sense of the period. And I think, and that's what I love about historical fiction, is when you get a real sense of what life was like for someone else in a different time. And I think people do get caught up in that, and then obviously if they know that something isn't quite right, maybe it niggles. You're like, but that's impossible because they didn't have forks then, and so then you get very angry about it. So there's almost a sense of, yeah, you're disrupting someone's experience. They want to be taken to a different period. They don't want to feel like, yeah, it's being disrupted by something that's not quite right. But again, that's very difficult because people's perception of what's not right may vary. There's obviously facts, like if there weren't any forks in England at a particular time, there weren't any forks. But you know, there's a lot of other things where it's far more of a grey area, and that's where it comes in.
I'm enjoying the image of your work enraging fork historians.
Well, I think it was one thing that really got me, because I hadn't really thought about it, and I was reading something, and at the time I was writing, the fork was an Italian novelty, and hardly anybody used forks, and it's just one of those things that you don't even think about, and it would be so easy to trip up on, because if I hadn't checked that, then I would have been just chucking forks in willy-nilly all over the place.
Right.
And obviously there's levels to what different people are going to pick up. Like hopefully most people wouldn't notice, but there will be a fork historian who's reading it and is furious. And yeah, there's just a deep fear that the fork historian is going to read your book and be really angry.
Yeah, and say, what, a fork? Yeah, wonderful. I really want that reaction now. I think that's great. So you've got a woman from Ghana coming to England in the late 16th century, and taking over her husband's print business. So there's various kinds of literacies involved in those transitions, right? Literacy of English, literacy of writing, literacy of print. Can you tell us a bit about how that process worked for you in the book?
Yeah, so I knew that I wanted to set the book in the print world, because once I'd started reading about it and the characters, I just thought it was brilliant. And again, I guess as a writer, you're always interested in printing and publishing. And yeah, it was just a very buccaneering industry at the time. As you know, there were a lot of big characters, and there was a lot of infighting about who was allowed to print what. There were a lot of people printing things they shouldn't have been against copyright. And so I wanted to set it in that world, and I wanted the main character, who's a woman, to be able to participate in that. So when Susan comes from Ghana, she's brought up in a noble household, and so she's educated with the daughter, and they both learn to read and write, and speak different languages. And then there was the print literacy, was kind of how to get her involved in that, in actually sort of taking on the print work. And the sort of road into that was the fact that it's that her husband is printing Catholic texts secretly from a hidden press in the house. And so in that context, you'd probably want all the help you can get. And she also has learned something about invisible inks from her mistress. So she's got already quite a useful skill set. And then she's obviously brought in to help with the secret printing, which gives her the skills she needs to take it on later, as well as probably just learning how to manage a bunch of workmen, which I imagine was a skill in itself if you were a woman, that you would have had to learn to be quite diplomatic, and a lot of people management skills as well. So that was how that literacy progressed. And then there's a kind of separate literacy, which is she inherits 3 objects from her mother, which were brought over from Ghana and with her. So she came over with her mother, and her mother died when she was small, and she has just these 3 small objects. Oh no, it's 2, sorry. She starts with 2, a bird figurine and a ladder. And these are objects which have meanings in Ghana. So they are gold weights, but they also have proverbs associated with them. And these are quite important. And at the time, there was a huge range of different meanings associated with all of them. So she's also trying to understand these objects that she has no knowledge of, because she's been cut off from her birth country.
Yeah.
And so that's another kind of literacy that she is trying to discover along the way.
Wow, thank you. That's even more literacy than I'd anticipated. And if it's all right to turn some of that around to your practice, you were doing this work. I don't know what your timescale was for the work behind the book, but as you were working on the book, the worlds of book history, women's history, histories of race were changing as well alongside you, right? So could you tell us a bit about what that felt like, or how you engaged with those different worlds?
Yeah, well, it took completing the book from idea to finish actually took about 15 years. Wow. Because I had the idea after university, so that was kind of 2003. And at that point, obviously, the big difference was how much information there was on the internet. And so when I started researching the book, well, the idea for having an African heroine actually came from my downstairs neighbour. I was living in Brixton, and the guy who lived underneath us was a Nigerian actor. And I said, I want to write a historical novel set in sort of 16th century. And he said, please put some black people in it, because there have been black people in Britain since at least Roman times. You never see an African person in historical novels or dramas. So that kind of was what prompted me to start researching. And at that point, I didn't know how to write a novel. I didn't really know how to research. And so I kind of hit quite a few brick walls, and I came back to it a few times over the years, but properly took it back up again in about 2011. And by this point, Miranda Kaufman was starting was doing her PhD, which was going to later turn into Black Tudors. And another author called Onyeka Nubia, who's also written a book about Black Tudors. They were both studying under Marika Sherwood. And I kind of reached out to Marika, having read an essay she'd written, and she passed me on to them. And so by this point, Miranda shared her research with me, and also directed me to some online directories, like the Black and Asian Lives in the Archives of the Guildhall Library, which made a big difference. The fact that I could access information just from because I'm an independent researcher. I did later have an affiliation with Bath Spa University, which let me access journals, the EBO and ESTC, to research print history. But as an independent researcher, you're quite dependent on other people's kindness and sort of finding the right academic who can point you in the right direction. So having some of this information available online made a big difference. So that changed quite a lot. And I think I had more confidence in myself in approaching people to ask for help. So I wrote to Paul Nash, who ran the print room at the Bodleian Library, and he let me come along and actually try my hand at using a printing press. I spoke to Helen Smith at York about women printers. I felt more able to reach out to people, and the team at Bath Spa, Tracy and Ian, and they were very kind and helpful. But yeah, so by the time I was actually writing it, there was much more information available about Black people in Britain in the early modern period, which I could kind of build on, which was the main thing that really helped.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's an amazing community of scholars and resources you're talking about there.
Yeah,
We should clarify for listeners that EBO and the ESTC, those are two online databases giving access to print records, right?
that's right. So you can actually read copies of digitized copies of early modern books, which was brilliant, because you can something about being able to see the original printing layout and the blocks and the text, the different fonts they use, because in fact the book includes a code that's based on a printing press. So I did have to get quite involved in like looking at print press layouts and learning a bit about fonts and typefaces. So it was very helpful to just see books, the original books, and brilliant, because again, if you can't necessarily afford to go and find all the original copies in the very different places where they are, so to be able to access those was brilliant.
Great, we'll come back to that in a minute. And also just to unpack some of the things you were saying earlier, your two colleagues Tracy and Ian, that's Tracy Hill and Ian Gadd.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Right. No, don't worry.
Yeah.
We'll put some resources up alongside this video on our website so people can follow along some of these suggestions. So it's lovely to have this community of people that you're talking about. It's really great.
It is. Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think what's really nice is that so many of them are on Twitter.
Yes.
So it's really interesting. There's this whole group of scholars who are very deeply involved in the past, in the early modern period, but who are very accessible on Twitter and exchanging ideas, and yourself and them Before Shakespeare project included, which is, for anyone who's looking at writing a historical novel set in this period, and I just found people to be so helpful and so open to sharing information with me, and I think that can be a barrier if you're worried, if you're writing a historical novel and you're worried about where to find information. I actually found the best thing to do was to ask someone who knew more than me, rather than I did trawl through a lot of books, but actually the best information came from people who could kind of give me a breakdown of their research very succinctly and much quicker than it would have taken me to read, and who were really, really open to sharing, and not at all kind of not protective of their research, which is brilliant. So I would encourage writers to reach out.
Thank you. Well, you're performing the same service now because, these films are designed to be useful for anyone who wants to come along and listen to them. And I'm sure there are lots of people listening to you now and thinking about how might I do something like this. So you're performing exactly the same service.
Okay.
Right now. Kate, is it all right to rewind a little bit to,
yes.
You mentioned tantalizingly the secret code. Am I saying that right? The secret code lying behind the font choices and the other kind of design choices to the books which your protagonist was publishing. Have I got that right?
So not quite. There's her husband, who was a real printer called John Charlwood, who was a very interesting character, who printed the work of Giordano Bruno, who was at the time a very controversial heretic ex-Catholic monk who was writing some really, really radical stuff about the universe and how it's constructed, looking at atoms, denying the resurrection and all sorts of dangerous things. So John Charlwood printed these books, which were, kind of dynamite. But he also is potentially the person who printed the works of Robert Southwell, the Catholic poet, in the mid-1590s. So I had Susan marry him because he was so interesting. And he's obviously caught up in a lot of secret activities, some of which she knows about and some of which she doesn't. And there's a code that she later has to break, which is based on the layout of the typecases, so where all the different letters are put in the typecases. So that's kind of the code that she's trying to figure out a bit later on in the book.
And as a writer working with that code yourself and thinking about your readers, are you hoping that they will engage with that code? What are your aims and designs in giving them this code from a completely different culture?
I did think I sort of did it so that if you followed all the clues, you could figure it out yourself if you wanted to, but you would have to go and look at original copies of the books that are mentioned. So I don't know how many people would, and to be honest, it was a bit of a nightmare, and I wish I'd never started because it ended up being really complicated, and I had to check several times that I'd actually got it right. So I like things like that in books. I like a bit of a mystery that you feel that you might be able to solve if you could trace it along and follow the clues. So I think that was it. I think I changed course a bit halfway through writing it. I think the original draft that I sent off to agents was a bit more literary and probably a bit more boring. It was quite long, and there was a lot more about the print world because I fell so in love with it. And as it went through more drafts, with my agent, with Jacaranda, it got more exciting because I decided what I really wanted was a really good story that you want to follow through and that has some twists and turns and excitement. So sort of literary but exciting. I love Sarah Waters' books, so I was kind of going for something along those lines where you want to keep reading and you're kind of rooting for the heroine. So that was where the code came into it partly. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And kind of picking up on what you were saying there, it's making me wonder, does detail or research or literariness, to use the word you were using a minute ago, does that get in the way of story? Is there a sense that story is constantly going in this direction, let's say, and then all these other things are sort of impediments holding it up in some way?
Not necessarily. I
Right.
think I don't want to pit them against each other, because a lot of people can do both and do them really well. And I think the issue with my first draft was more that I got so involved in I wanted to convey the experience of the world, and I got very involved in writing in a language that conveyed to me a sense of how people talked and thought at that time, without being too heavy. But so that took a lot of crafting and a lot of work. But I think in doing that, I just wasn't sure what to do about the plot so much. So I think I managed to get the feeling of it, the sense of being in that world. But you need more than that. You need something that's going to sort of pull people along. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a twisty turny plot. Like, people write amazing books that are, someone just living their life quietly and amazing things happening to them day to day. But I decided I needed more, especially with the first novel. I think I didn't have the technical ability to pull that off yet. And I love big stories and plots. With a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, thank you. As a reader and researcher in the period, in the early modern period, it's one of the things that I'm always very, very aware of, is whether plot is a joy or a problem for particular writers. And I work on the very, very early kind of phase of the English novel. So early that some people don't like to use the word novel at all, but the kind of the prose fictional stories which are happening around the period you're looking at. But even with more kind of famous texts like As You Like It, for example, I always think As You Like It's a great example of a play where the playwright accidentally ran out of plot by the end of Act 1.
Yeah.
So much happens in Act 1, and then for the next 4 acts, everyone's looking at their watches and reading each other poems. And then, thank goodness, there's a lion attack at one point, but it happens off stage by mistake.
It's true, yeah.
So the problem of plot, and whether plot is something that a text or the text author is in love with or moved by, or whether actually what they're interested in is the bits between the plot. That feels like a live issue in the period, as well as hearing you talking about your own issue as a writer.
Yeah, I suppose it's a perennial problem. And again, having read a lot of plays from the period, I agree there are some, and I think that's where it helps as a modern reader, especially if you're not someone who's immersed in those texts. If there is a good plot, it really helps. Because otherwise you can get very lost in just a lot of dukes or people doing things, and you've got no idea what the jokes are because the language is a barrier. And I think I found the plot the hardest thing, like bar none, about writing the book, and that was what took the most work, over and above everything else, even the imagining yourself into characters from 500 years ago, or to writing a black woman from 500 years ago. Just actually wrestling the plot into shape was awful, and I'm not looking forward to doing it again in my next book, but I guess it will happen somehow. And I don't know if that's true of everyone, but yeah.
Do you mind if do you mind if I ask then what drives you to doing the awful thing? What brings you back to wanting to make that plot happen?
I just really love writing stories or thinking of stories, and I suppose when you start writing, you have a sense of maybe a character or a place in your head, and you're just really interested in that character or place or whatever scene has kind of sparked your imagination. So when I started, or actually when I was some way into writing it, because I started off with 4 main characters who 3 of them kind of got cut, I just had this image of an African woman in a bookshop in early modern London, and what was she doing there, and how had she got there, and so you just have this like urge to find out where they're going and where they've come from, and where it all goes. And I think for some people, they plan and they like to have the story all set out and they do it in advance, and I found that I can't. I have to write it out and see what happens, which is maybe why I find it so stressful. But yeah, there's you've got to know how it finishes, and I think there's also that sense of any piece of creative work where you kind of got a sense in your head. I think someone said something, maybe it was Virginia Woolf or someone, about it's like the idea is like a cathedral, and you're putting it together, and it just looks like this garden shed, and you're just trying to make it worthy of whatever you've got in your head. And so you do your 9, 10, 11, 12 drafts, and several times I stopped. There were various times where I stopped because I couldn't see what to do next, and I had to put it down and go away, and other people needed to have fresh eyes on it, whether that was my agent or the editors at Jacaranda, Valerie Brands and Cherise Lopez Baker, who were brilliant, to kind of give you fresh eyes and see where you need to go next.
Yeah. I feel like we live in a world which quite drastically separates the world of creative writing and the world of research-based writing, but actually the process you're describing is so similar to what I would find in that I constantly feel like I need other eyes on it, and I also have to ask the question of whether story is in play with the kind of, am I simply just reporting stuff I found from the research process, or am I looking to attach them, yoke them to some kind of story or some kind of narrative shape? It's fascinating hearing it from your perspective. And yeah, plot again, as a reader, I'm really bad at names, and I'm really bad at faces. I'm an incompetent human being, so I find plot very hard to follow, both with live storytelling like theatre, but also TV or film. I've got no idea who anyone is any of the time, and the same with reading a book. I often am not in it for plot.
Okay.
I find plot driven material often. It's not the plot that's bringing me into a book first time around, which is ridiculous. But it's fascinating to hear about different people's relationship with plot.
Yeah, well, I can see that too, and I love books where the thing that draws you in is the characters or the sense of place. Or I think I love those as well. There's kind of a balance with everything. Yeah, you're right.
And I love the idea that your starting point was this image of a black woman in a bookshop, is how you put it, right?
Yeah. And just kind of finding out where she'd come from, and that obviously took quite a while to figure it out and get it right. And again, that was partly based on archival research. So Miranda recommended a lot of primary sources for me for looking at kind of European accounts of engagement with Africans at that point, which is interesting because at this point the slave trade from Britain hadn't taken off at all. Spain and Portugal were dominating it, so it's not that the UK had any scruples about it. It was purely that they couldn't break into it because Spain and Portugal were more powerful. But I found it interesting that at this point, so the main thing that Britain wants to do is trade with Africa, and things could have been very different if it could have gone in a different direction at this point, when the relationships were based on trade and not at that point total exploitation. And so it's interesting to read how people were interacting with each other, and the fact that there were many Africans who did end up in England at this point for various reasons. And again, slavery had no legal basis in England at the time. which is not to say that people came willingly. Many people were captured from Spanish or Portuguese slave ships and brought to England. So a lot of people coming to England had no choice in the fact that they ended up there. But people were working as servants in households or as tradesmen and women, independently earning their own money. And so you have a lot of archival records of Africans in England being baptized and being buried, marrying, and it's fascinating to track that. But it was also in building a character, like looking at archives doesn't necessarily give you everything you need. You have sometimes a few sort of scraps, like a date and a name. And especially as a white author writing a black character, I sort of knew maybe the limits of my capacity to really get the experience of a black person in an all-white country, or nearly all-white country. And I was also helped by a lady called Esua Goldsmith, who's also got a book coming out with Jacaranda this year, whose dad was Ghanaian and her mum's white British, and she grew up in white neighbourhoods in the 1970s. And she was talking on Radio 4 about meeting her dad later in life and kind of discovering her roots and what it meant to her. And I wrote to her and asked if I might be able to talk to her, and she said yes, and we had a really a good conversation. She's writing her autobiography, which is now being published, and she was the first woman and the first black student president of Leicester University Students' Union back in the day. So she's an amazing person. And so her I think about people as archives as well, of kind of understanding and knowledge and history. And so she helped me hugely in kind of getting a sense of how it would feel to be an African woman in early modern London. Very different times, but there are experiences that would be the same.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. And it ties into a theme we keep hearing across these videos about Matthew Lyons in his film for us talks about how we're separated at the moment by space from each other, but we're not separated by time from various kinds of historical lives. And you're sort of thinking about it in the other way round, in that you're thinking about a situation where you are separated by time, but by talking to people who are alive now and about their own subjective experiences of race, for example, and racial difference, thinking about how that works historically. That's really exciting, I think.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's interesting when you think about the connections that we do, or things we have in common with people from the past, and there are big things that I think, you know, are the same, even if they're experienced slightly differently, culture and how you deal with them. So death, and things like the death of a child. I think people tend to think that, you know, in early modern times people had so many children, you know, a child dies, it's God's will, you move on. And if you read things like Ben Jonson's poem to his son, you can kind of see that's really not true. Like it matters hugely, and people invested a huge amount of love, and so that's a very universal experience, and that's something that you can kind of tap into, that makes it feel less distant as a place.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. We're ending these videos by asking our contributors about the word literature and whether it's a useful word to them or not, where it sits in their professional or their personal practice, where it sits in their language, I suppose. And you used the phrase earlier that one of your early drafts for this book was more literary and therefore more boring. So I'm expecting some really interesting thoughts from you here. But yeah, what does the word literature mean to you?
I'm feeling really bad now about having said more literary and more boring, because
No.
I love literary novels. So maybe it's a hangover from having done English literature at university and having to go through texts with a fine-tooth comb. And I think I found actually that was a barrier when I'd finished to doing my own writing, because A, you're reading a lot of amazing authors and thinking how much better they are than you, and B, you're deconstructing the text so much that you often kind of lose a sense of you discover a lot of amazing texts, but you also maybe forget, you lose the joy in it because you're writing about them and kind of just doing them to death. And so I think that took me a while to recover from, like, doing an English literature degree and then having the confidence to produce my own work and show it to people. I think especially, again, I did my degree at Cambridge 20 years ago, very white, very male canon. Yeah, there were women, but it was, we stopped. The modern paper stopped at T.S. Eliot. I think in the American paper we did some more modern writers, but that probably, that affects how you think of what literature is, I suppose. And I've read so many more amazing books since then that wouldn't have been on that canon and maybe are struggling to squeak in now. Yeah, I'd like the idea of a literature that is far more inclusive and not restrictive, which unfortunately I think it still is. I think there's still a perception that if you're going to be in a literary canon, you are probably dead and probably white and probably a man, and it needs to change. So maybe that's why I have a slight itch about the word literature.
Yeah, two massive issues there. One about exclusion. Literature is an exclusive and excluding phenomenon or concept, but also that idea of the hangover of being made to kind of deconstruct text with a tooth comb, as you put it. Yeah, I mean, just in kind of random chats to people I meet in my private life, if ever I make the mistake of saying what I do for a living, I can always be pretty confident someone will say to me, oh, I'm not interested in taking things apart in fine detail. And certainly for me, I'm always interested in literature as a live phenomenon, and encouraging my students, of course, if you want to get into fine detail, that's fantastic, and do that. But thinking about how that fine detail relates to the live moment of hearing or reading a text for the first time, that's what gets me really excited. So it's really interesting to hear about that hangover. Even someone like you, who's obviously passionate as both a writer and a reader, felt from studying this thing called literature.
Yeah, I think it was partly the context in which it was studied, and probably the text we were studying, and yeah, I don't know if it's different now. I hope that it's different, but I get the feeling that it's not as different as it could be. But yeah, I think especially if you're writing, you need to kind of be able to, is letting go of the inner editor, and just not being afraid to write anything that comes into your head, especially with a first draft, and giving yourself permission to get it wrong and write badly, and make mistakes, because you can go over and correct it. And if you're starting off writing with the image in your head of the book that you want it to be, which is never going to live up to all the dead writers, then you're immediately kind of stymied straight off the bat. So yeah, you need to kind of just get rid of all the bones of the old writers, bury them, and jump up and down on their graves, and then do something new.
Maybe we can do that for our next video with you.
Definitely into that. Yeah.
Bring it on.
Yeah.
And I neither want to end the video on a downer, nor try and rescue the downer with some sort of Disney happy. Yeah, hopefully some of this, the situation you're describing is changing, and certainly the people that you've already name-checked in this video, think about the work that they're doing collectively with their students, some of whom will be the academics of the future, and the novelists of the future. Hopefully these things are changing, but I recognise that they're not changing fast enough, for sure. Kate, it's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's been brilliant.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye.